Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Cresco's webinar titled Financing Africa's Transport Infrastructure to Unlock Regional Integration. My name is Conrad Hefer. I'm the Group Managing Director for Cresco Group. We've got a lot of people that registered for the webinar, so I'm glad we've got a topical theme that has been put forward. Cresco has gone to a lot of trouble to invite our esteemed speakers to join us for this discussion. I think in the environment we're living in, this is quite topical. And ultimately, it is we set up these webinars ultimately to provide our sort of thought leadership around some of these topics. From a Cresco point of view, I would like to sort of set the scene for the discussions to follow. And I'm doing that through sharing our problem statement that we've put forward for this discussion. I'll read it to the audience this afternoon. Africa's infrastructure needs are vast and rising. The African Development Bank estimates annual requirements of 130 to 170 billion, which is with a financing shortfall of between 68 to 108 billion. Transport infrastructure consisting of roads, rail, ports, and border posts accounts for the largest share of this gap. In South Africa, the situation is equally stark. Much of the road and rail network is aging, logistic constraints undermining exports, and public transport systems are struggling with safety, reliability, and funding. The core problem is that public budgets alone can not catch up. Debt levels rising, interest costs, and competing priorities such as health and education mean governments face severe fiscal constraints. The backlog of crumbling infrastructure grows larger each year. This reality has sharpened as a critical question. How can governments gear their limited budgets by using project finance and private capital to deliver more transport infrastructure faster? Now, I'm sure most of the audience members can relate to this problem statement. And for that reason, we set up this webinar to sort of do our thought leadership and our sort of knowledge share around what the makeup of the problem is, to sort of set the scene around that at a regional level and specifically on the transport infrastructure side, and then bring in the different topic experts to sort of guide us through their perspective on how to solve this problem. So we've set up a panel of speakers. I think the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Cor Botha from Zutari, which is bringing the sort of sector and technical perspective to the regional problem that we're dealing with. So without any further ado, Cor, can I hand over to you?
So, Conrad and Cresco team, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I should say, a special thanks for making me the first speaker. It means that I can focus on the problem, and I'll then hand over to my fellow presenters to come up with some of the solutions. It makes my life quite easy. Now, as you mentioned, this is quite a passionate topic, one that's quite topical to all of the people in the room, but also the whole region, which also means that it brings up a lot of subjective opinions. So I thought for today, as let's say a first session and almost an introduction into this topic, let's rather try to take stock of the conventional wisdom out there. And I had a look at some of the published reports and some ongoing research from various organizations, just to see how bad is the situation. Is it something that we really have to focus on? So as you can imagine, there are diverse opinions out there, even from the actual researchers. But let me take you just through 3 very simple slides. So the first question is it worth the hype? Do we need to talk about transport and logistics infrastructure? And what is the size of the prize? Well, let's put a couple of numbers on it. The reports say that the transport sector accounts for about 6 to 8% of our GDP. And just about all the reports agree that the corridors are very necessary for trade, both regionally and globally. So to put some order of magnitude numbers to it, we expect to exceed about 500 million tons per annum through our ports anytime soon. And in the next, let's say, 10 or so years, our 6 landlocked countries in the SADC region might achieve up to 150 million of those tons. So that's quite significant. So the infrastructure is clearly important for trade facilitation and for the regional's economic sustainability. But let's look at how bad the current situation is. On the road side, we have almost 1 kilometer of road, and apparently less than half of it is in what we could call a good condition. Now, depending on the source of info, between 30 and 40% of our roads are in need of urgent rehabilitation. The maintenance backlog, as you also mentioned, is enormous. It's more than $40 billion. And as we all know, a stitch in time saves 9. That graph on the right-hand side is one we all know very well. Apparently, if we had spent about $12 billion, we could have avoided most of that backlog. So we are behind the curve in terms of maintenance. On the rail side, we have around 45,000 kilometers of track, but it is generally old. Much of it is built on low standards. Interoperability is limited, and we carry only a small market share of the freight at the moment. Road still dominates freight transport, and it includes a so-called rail-friendly cargo, like the bulk cargoes. So we need to improve that situation. So some of the reports indicate that there are some key levers that we could pull to improve our railway situation. All of them are in agreement that clearing the maintenance backlog is a high priority, but they do mention that we should focus only on some of the priority lines, and we should also focus as part of that rehab to use it as an opportunity to improve our interoperability where possible. Most of them mention rolling stock as a big concern, and most of them mention that our train control systems are just not modern enough, and we need to improve on our digital acumen on the rail side. So some of the reports estimates that if we could pull these 3 levers, we could double our throughput in the next 10 years. So it looks like there might be some light at the end of that tunnel. On the port side, SADC's collective port throughput grew very well over the last 2 decades, but we are falling well behind with our global competitors because we sit with long dwell times, we sit with shallow drafts, which we never improved, and both our water side and our land side remains congested. So many of the reports also highlight our poor and outdated systems, and that it prevents seamless connectivity to the hinterland. So the situation is not great. So clearly we have fallen behind when it comes to transport infrastructure and logistics support. So we are behind both in terms of building new and in maintaining what we have. And we need to catch up. But what can we do? Well, first, let's understand the logistics problem. And Ian, after me, will discuss this in far more detail, I hope. Less than 10% of our projects reach financial close. Now, that means that only about half of them even get to feasibility. That is not very good. And there were about 100 projects that were followed over the last couple of decades, and it was found that only about 5% of those were actually completed. So that's quite low in terms of success rate or conversion rate. Now, some of the consultants in the room will like this next bullet. The reports indicate that if we had spent more money, typically between 5 to 12% on project activities, we could have increased that conversion rate to 30 to 40%. So consultants, there's really some work out there, and we need to chase those fees. But the reports they vary significantly on the actual point of how much do we have to spend. I think, Conrad, you mentioned something like 60 to 108 or something. The required investment between 50 and 90 concurs just about with that same number. Now, whether the number is right or not is not the issue. The point is we have a massive investment challenge. Now, if we look at, so that's the infrastructure side. If we look at the logistics side of things, the World Bank regularly publishes the so-called LPI, the Logistics Performance Index for various countries. Now, it tracks some scores, some metrics. If you look on the top right-hand side in that graph, it looks at things like customs, competence, tracking and tracing, etc. Now, Ian will understand this way better again. But if we plot our region, this is now all of the SADC countries, or Sub-Saharan Africa countries, I should say, against other regions in the world. This radar graph shows you how badly we are performing and where actually are the worst of the lot. Now, how this radar graph thing works is it counts from 0 in the center and then up to, I think the score is 5 on the outer sector. So the closer you are to the middle, the worse it is. So we are basically as bad as it gets. So until recently, we've been referring to this so-called logistics crisis. I don't know why, but in the last couple of months, we've dropped the word crisis, but it still seems like we're not out of the woods yet. It is estimated that our logistics costs us around a third of our product value, and that is 3 times as high as some of the other regions that perform better. Specifically, if you look at the OECD countries, their cost contribution from the logistics side is only about 10%. So lastly, on this side, just about all the reports agree that private sector is the way to improve our situation. So there are estimates that in the next 10 years, more than 40% of our transport infrastructure spend could be from private sector. Now that can be in various ways, shapes and forms, and I'm sure some of my other colleagues will present a little bit on what options we have in that regard. So I'm not going to try and elaborate that too much. So lastly, what do all the reports then suggest? This is my last slide. Now, it's difficult to summarize all of the bulk of information out there, but in this overly summarized version, it looks like there are only a few key points we have to focus on. We must create and maintain our infrastructure. Now, that could be done through structural reforms, like the National Department of Transport's PSP drive is something that is widely supported. We must prioritize our maintenance activities across the whole network, both road, rail, and port. And we need to improve our project conversion rates by ensuring diligent project preparation. Those are key metrics that just about all the reports agree on. And then all the reports are also largely aligned on private sector as being our salvation. Now, this is both in terms of capital investments, but also in modernizing our systems and lowering our logistics costs. So I think the message of what we find in the conventional reports out there is that we are in trouble. We need to improve urgently, and fixing the transport system is definitely worth it. So what we have on the screen is a list of what must be done. I think the real question is, how do we do it? And hopefully, if I pass this proverbial hospital pass to my other co-presenters, they might be able to shed some more light on this topic. So Conrad, as an introduction, I hope that sort of sets the scene, and it gels very well with your introduction. So let's see if there are some solutions out there. Thanks, Conrad.
Thanks, Cor. I think the scene has been set, as they say. I also need to apologize. I did not handle housekeeping matters in the initial introduction. So can I please request the audience members, we'll have time for Q&A after the presentations. And if the process we're looking to follow is for the audience members, if you've got any questions to the speakers, please put that forward in the messaging part of the webinar. And if we've got enough time left, we'll try to run through that at the end of the presentations. So apologies for not putting that up front. Another matter is that in terms of the presentations, that is part of the webinar, as well as recording of the webinar, will be shared with the audience members afterwards. So sorry for not mentioning that. Thank you, Cor. Then in your setting the scene, you referenced a crisis. So I think Ian Bird's probably the best person to explain how this crisis is being managed and giving us an update on it. Ian Bird is a executive consultant. He's currently working for Business for South Africa as part of the NLCC, the National Logistics Crisis Committee. There's that word that calls through around. I'm glad you, I don't know, Ian, did you remove the crisis bit to the name yet or not? Is it still in the name?
Still in the name.
Still in the name. Okay, great. So I'm going to hand over to Ian to take us through the B4SA update and where we stand in terms of solving at least the logistics part of this problem as we stand. Thank you, Ian. Over to you.
Good. Yeah, thanks very much, Conrad, and welcome to everybody on the platform. Much appreciated to, again, contextualize. This is a perspective from B4SA. We are not the National Logistics Crisis Committee. That's a creature of the government, run out of the presidency and Operation Vulindlela. We engage as business with the National Logistics Committee through 8 work streams. dealing with a range of matters to revitalize the logistics of the country towards the growth that we so desperately seek for jobs and a future prosperity. If I could just go to the next slide, I'm just going to touch on a couple of points and then hopefully leave enough time later for conversation. If we can go to the next slide, thanks. Just a couple of key takeaways. We've been busy since basically mid of 23, April of 23, when the president announced the NLCC. On the left-hand side is our data points from that time. Particularly with reference to today, just on the ports, the dire position the ports found themselves in back then, as well as particularly the rail, which Cor has referenced earlier. And there was no clear roadmap at the time to structural reform, which is right down at the bottom, which is really the topic that we need to focus on today. The 149 million tonnes was Transnet's actual volumes for 22-23. And when we started, that volume was trending even further downwards to 142, where we find ourselves in mid of 25. In fact, literally a month or so back, port performance had improved dramatically, and the rail performance, these are our estimates. Transnet has a target of 181 for the current year to March of 26. B4SA is estimating somewhere around 171 to 174, so still not there yet. But critically, if we go to the light blue numbers at the bottom, you'll all be familiar. There's been 11 private rail operators announced, and significant work is ongoing with those preferred or successful applicants. And then more critically, 160 responses were received to the request for information issued by the PSP unit for the 3 priority corridors. And those responses were analysed, and the report of the analysis was released on Sunday, together with the next RFI, which dealt with passenger rail. So a lot of momentum on that. Still a lot of concerns, but clearly the team is pushing ahead. There are delays, understandably, given the complexity of the environment and the responses. As I'm been made to be aware that there is still time to comment on the response report, if you will, up until the end of November. So good news there. Critically, what we've also achieved through the NLCC and the engagement is, I think, a very good rebuilding of direct relationships the customers now have with Transnet, which were challenged previously. If we can then just go to the next slide. The volumes, just on this one, it's just a bit more of a summary, and it will be made available. The big issue at the moment, and the theme that we may want to touch on, is the market sentiment and the rating agencies leading to challenges with continued investment into the country, and your gross fixed capital formation challenges, which have been in the media recently. So Transnet not meeting their targets, and the Auditor General's views of certain of the performance more generally against the recovery plan is a concern. And I mean, clearly Transnet's very well aware of that, and the sentiment that originates from that level of performance. We still believe, as I said earlier, rail's going to miss their 25-26 targets, but TPT is really performing well, and is going to end, we believe, on budget or above. Security is a challenge. However, there's been significant improvement recently on the North Corridor, which for those responding to the RFPs going forward, I think would be of good news, including the train operating companies, who now will be a lot more comforted on the performance. The one outstanding matter at the moment is the conditionalities which are attached to the recent 150 billion rand consolidated guarantees that have been provided. We really would like to see that. We believe those are critical to moving Transnet, the structural reform process, the performance, etc., forward. Those will hopefully be made available fairly shortly. To an earlier point made, Transnet is spending a ton of time working on the joint customer collaboration. The minister has made it quite clear that she's looking for funding from the private sector, together with Transnet can provide itself, together with the budget facility for infrastructure, which we may touch on just now. And they're doing work on how they can bring the customers' funding into key corridors and the corridor restoration particularly. I've spoken about third-party access, the RFP process. We're all familiar with now, and that's moving ahead, though delayed. And then on the Transport Economic Regulator, after a bit of a false start, a board has been finalised and is in place, and it is moving ahead, and that will govern then the arrangements for the train operating companies, both on what will be trim network and potentially the concessioned operations going forward. On the next slide, I've just touched on the volumes, which we've already referenced, but I think the big point on the right-hand side, well, the grey bar particularly, is that that target of 250 million tonnes was the minister's target that she set, and that's all rail transport. It's not TFR or the remnants of what may be TFR in Transnet. It includes then the private operators. A big jump from, let's talk around 171 for the year ending March of 26. You're looking at significant volumes in the private sector, and therefore the framework in which the train operating companies and the concessioned operations or PSP opportunities will be considered needs to be favourable for the market. And Cor mentioned that point quite strongly. As we said on the right-hand side, we've stabilised. We haven't improved to the level of what we're seeking in the economy, which is unfortunate. And then, as Cor pointed out, the structural reform really was driven by the freight logistics roadmap and remains, I think, the future of what is required to get the logistics system back to where it needs to be: rail, port, terminals, etc. On the next slide, we just touch on the issues around the private sector participation. We all know the RFI and reports were issued on the weekend, but critically at the bottom, I just wanted to highlight this very strong message in the forward to the reports, where they've said the clear response articulated in DOT's October 25 analysis is the market is ready, the assets exist, the window is closing. We need decisive action to turn plans into performance and partnerships into progress. That was in the DOT documents that were issued. So I think without any contestation, one can see that the department and the government is firmly behind this process. And most of you will be aware that in the 10-point economic action plan, the expediting of the performance, including private sector participation, was, I think, item number 2, in fact, on the list. If we go to the next slide, the situation, and again, just touching on what we have been dealing with in terms of the economic growth, we seriously are looking at what we have termed a virtuous cycle with economic growth, driving job creation, changing the sentiment, and it continues in that. Unfortunately, we haven't achieved the aspirational targets that we were looking at when we started out here. We're probably around 1% now, as opposed to what we were anticipating or aspirationally hoping would be closer to 3%. And we must do everything we can not to fall into the vicious cycle that I've put at the bottom of the slide. And I think that's the challenge, is the market sentiment and the SA story. On the next slide, we've just summarized where we stand at the moment. If we could just jump to the next slide. Yeah. So in summary, the performance improvements remain below what the economy demands, and Cor has made that point. We need to accelerate the pace of structural reforms. We need critically to address the capacity at the key institutions who are driving the reforms, both in the various departmental side, the SOCs, as well as in the regulatory environment. We can't have a vacuum on the other side, and that's part of the partnership that business has got with government, is how do we capacitate those key institutions and, in fact, the layers below the boards and executives of those institutions, and that's where the rubber hits the road. If we're going out with RFPs and train operating companies and the like, you're going to have a ton of lawyers and transaction advisors and skilled individuals working in the private sector that desperately needs to ensure that they have a counterpart on the other side that they can work with and ensure that the process is carried forward with speed and ethically and is hopefully not open to legal challenge. And then lastly, on the Transnet end state, which I think we've had in the papers and the media recently, that is going quite slowly. TNPA, trim, LeaseCo and the rolling stock, those are all key milestones that need to be achieved as we move to the end state of Transnet, and the Minister has been mentioning, where does Transnet end up with all this activity in the train operating companies or third-party access and the private sector space. And she has set out quite clearly how the government sees it, but we really do need to move it forward at speed, and businesses assisting where they can in the various thinking around that, together with World Bank and other thoughts. And then lastly, just to put everybody's mind at rest, we are evolving the partnership on the next slide for Millie around as things happen. We are dealing with continue to deal with the challenges through this evolving structure. We're in phase 3, we're in phase 2 now, moving into phase 3. Critically, as I've said all along, we need to focus on selling the South African incorporated story. And what has also been in the press most recently from a media briefing is the possible inclusion of new focal areas. We already have energy, transport and logistics, and crime and corruption, together with the youth employment. And one is starting to look at what do we do in the adding potentially the water and areas dealing with, or an area dealing with the local government. There was a lot of noise around what role can the partnership play in Johannesburg. Those are all under consideration, but obviously it's bandwidth and resource dependent, if you will, from our side. But yes, we are committed, and I'm personally committed, and I think the partnership and the NLCC has proven its worth, perhaps not as quickly as we were hoping, or trying to achieve the outcomes that we were seeking in the beginning. But it is a very complicated environment, and we're just grateful for all the support that we're receiving from the private sector and members who are potentially on this platform. Cor, I'll leave it there, and hopefully the solutions, I'll hand over the hot potato to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. I think we've got a better perspective now in terms of what the game plan is, and what the focus areas are. Of course, this leads us onto the gap in terms of funding, and of course that is really where we need to apply our mind. It's one thing getting the ball to roll forward, but it's to have the capital to actually see it through for implementation. So our next speaker was supposed to be Sheryll Byrne from Standard Bank, talking about hospital passes. She's lost her voice. I'm not sure. It's likely not, hopefully not, sort of setting up for this webinar that she lost. I think she's got enough deals to manage, and I think that's where the voice was lost. So she's thrown the hospital pass to Pinge. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I've questioned his Greek ancestry as well, but we'll sort that out at another time. So Pinge is a Senior Vice President Investment Banking at Standard Bank, looking after energy and infrastructure in South and Central Africa, if I've got that right. But the focus from Standard Bank's point of view, of course, is the private sector capital side of things. I mean, there's a lot of debt needed, private capital investment needed, and it's all about understanding the risk considerations from a private sector capital perspective. So, Ipingi, can I hand over to you, and looking forward to you giving us the solution to our problem.
Thanks, Conrad. I was assuming that the bug was eventually going to stop somewhere, so typically it ends with the banks. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for having us on this webinar and kind of giving us an opportunity to kind of speak to how we're starting to look at kind of infrastructure development. I guess our key motto has always been, Africa is our home and we drive her growth. And I think one of the key unlocks for growth that we see on the continent is really about how we manage to fund infrastructure, because our belief is really that the infrastructure leads to development in other sectors. It unlocks the other sectors. It also has all the increased social and economic benefits that are associated with it. And I think it's probably a part that's been grossly underinvested, both from a maintenance perspective and from an expansion perspective. So I think the intention of our presentation is not to give potentially all the solutions, but to look at really how we sometimes look at funding some of these type of projects. What are the constraints? Because a lot of the time you have to look at a bespoke kind of transaction basis. And I think given your specific focus on regional integration, there are some challenges in that we actually often have to look at not just a country level and not just a specific project level, but the kind of interconnection between both country driven by that project. And I think the benefits on either side of that infrastructure, because it typically is bridging, can be two countries, it could be multiple. Vumile, if you can just move to the next slide, please. So I think the challenges have been very clearly laid out by Dr. Botha's presentation. I think one of the things that I would probably want to just raise here specifically is just around the financial risk. And I think he highlighted, the economic strength of the fiscus in a number of countries and their ability to fund is quite constrained. And so they are looking increasingly to the private sector for that kind of unlock of that capital. Just from the physical perspective, we've already can see that there's limited access. The road network only covering about 53% of the roads that are paved, and only 43% of the rural populations do have access to all these roads. I think that's also important to note when we start to look at individual projects around the projects that we're actually financing. As commercial entities or as investors, you typically want to look at it with a view towards return, but also recognition that sometimes the implementation of this infrastructure has got a significant social focus. And that's not something that you necessarily are going to get a commercial return on. And I think when it comes to, the allocation and understanding kind of the revenue generation capability of the project, that's always something to bear in mind. And I guess a couple of the other points to raise, I think on the rail networks, I think I would highlight there specifically that we do have quite a fragmented railway networks. I think some of the networks have developed just on a need to use basis on specific projects, with maintenance falling behind. They're not really fit for purpose, some of the networks that we have, and not really for the purpose of the integrated trade that we are trying to achieve. And I've already spoken about the funding bottlenecks. And I guess another point is just around climate resilience. This is the increased focus for us. This already underinvestment in the infrastructure is now having to bear the brunt of, increased climatic effects, flooding and other natural disasters. And this limited fiscus has also very limited ability to recover from that. So we already have underinvestment. It's now being exacerbated by large events. And so you're almost facing this onward kind of downward spiral overall in terms of the infrastructure state. And then cross-border, I think this is the point that I just mentioned previously. It's around the cooperation. So the way that I think we want to see some of this infrastructure development is trying to kind of facilitate opportunities that unlock trade and regional trade. I think some of our key strategy focuses around energy transition and energy security, and that's also supported by infrastructure investment. So essentially the support for mining, outputs that are coming out of the region, as well as inputs going to those regions, need to be carried across infrastructure. I think there was a mention of how much of that freight at the moment is covered by road, and how much of that needs to potentially be converted towards rail, particularly if you want to kind of get the efficiencies to be able to get those necessary throughputs. And I think it also has the additional benefit, obviously, of taking additional traffic off the roads, which reduces the maintenance requirement, as well as, the other social externalities such as accidents and the like. As you can see, we are focused on transactions for infrastructure across the region, across Africa. My specific focus is towards transaction in SADC, but as I said, we really do need to stop looking specifically only at project focused and single project focused, and really look at integrated regional projects. Vumile, if you'll just move to the next slide, please. I think the three main models that we utilize, and I'll start with concession-based. It's typically what we're trying to unlock here in terms of the private sector-led development. So the intention here is really to start saying we need to get private sector participation, where essentially the entity, private sector or the investor, is going to take responsible for the end-to-end development of the entire project. And then without having outright ownership, the intention is that they develop this project, run it and operate it for a period of time, get back their return, and then after a period of time sufficient to earn that return, it gets returned back to the public sector or to the government entity that owns it at the maturity of that triple P, as it were. The intention is that whatever revenue is earned under that model is going to provide the adequate compensation for the investors, so both the equity investor as well as the debt investors during this period. And the challenge that we typically would have is, in the event of this being terminated prematurely, the investors and the debt funders are going to be expecting compensation for essentially what they've put into the project because they do not have the ownership thereof. And I think some of the challenges that we have around bankability and being able to launch the projects is really around managing some of that risk. It is quite difficult because, as we mentioned, the fiscus is quite limited. And so the view that you would take on what that risk would be in the event of a termination could be quite significant, given that a lot of the fiscuses are a little bit challenged at the moment, and so that limits, I guess, the investor participation and the bankability ultimately of these projects. Then just moving, if we almost want to then move towards more government participation, because essentially now you wanted to say, well, the ultimate owner theoretically can they potentially fund that? To the point around the limited fiscus in place, there's very limited capability. So I think lenders who would want to fund projects directly to the asset owner or the public entity would want to do an analysis of that balance sheet. And typically that balance sheet is not necessarily as healthy as one would like. We would spend typically an amount of time to do analysis and assessment of that. And there will be typically kind of concerns around whether or not this would be a viable, almost is any viable revenue to be able to justify this project. Often also as well, the funding that's utilized, we need to look and see, are these proceeds actually reaching the intended cause? It may be that they may be misused or channeled elsewhere. So some of the tweaks typically that you would do then is to say, well, we're not necessarily we're going to ensure that we provide the EPC knowledge or the EPC contract as well as financing stapled to this project so that we can ensure that it's correctly executed. We can mitigate some of the construction risk, and as well, we can ensure that there's a limited misuse of funds. I think the last kind of model, the ring fencing, just addresses part of the balance sheet concerns that we've raised before. So even though the balance sheet may look a little bit challenged, you do often find pockets of really good credit which you can utilize to fund against. Some of those that we've looked at is typically consistent, like budgetary allocations or road levies is often used, or some form of payments that have a long track record, which have, I think, a reasonable amount of predictability, and those typically lend themselves to a really good kind of structure, as long as you have the framework in country, which essentially supports, because typically a lot of these are legislated in a format under a government act or something like that, and they're not fully intended to use for financing of projects, and you may need to have a little bit of work done to get that framework to accommodate such funding models that we've implemented. But we have managed to successfully implement a number of those, and I think the appetite for those regionally, we have noticed, has started to increase. Vamila, if we will just go to the next slide, please. And then just looking at these specific revenue models, so just spoken about the levies, but if we move back, I think, just to the kind of concession model, the first kind of model we look at in terms of the revenue is just a real toll tariff, where essentially the customer or the users are going to pay directly for the use of the asset. Obviously, this is advantageous to the government in the fact that they don't really take any of the fiscal risk. They don't, they then can utilize their limited resources to allocate to other concerns. But unfortunately, as I pointed out, that means that sometimes you need to have really good revenue or justified traffic risk to be able to say, for example, on a toll road, can we have enough volumes here to be able to justify it? And I think to the point that I raised around that part of the needs that we're funding are linked to interregional trade, but some of those also have a social aspect and increased regional rural connectivity. It may be such that, that sufficient volume of traffic isn't really sufficient to be able to kind of repay let's say, long-term financing on that project. And the return for investors is likely to be potentially limited. And also, I think in some countries where this model is now starting to be implemented, they do not have a history of paying for roads. Roads, essentially, the cost really borne by the users has only been, I guess, paying for fuel, paying for maintenance of your own vehicle. And the introduction of tolls has been kind of difficult and is a little bit politically and both socially sensitive in a number of countries. And I think just the other points that are included in this table is around the heightened amount of due diligence that really needs to be done, because theoretically you're taking a view on long-term 15-year plus financing on traffic risk, and the ability to really forecast 15 years into the future on traffic risk can be a little bit difficult, especially if there's the potential for competing routes to be implemented. There's potential for the trade dynamics to change. And so that part really requires quite an aggressive and extensive due diligence for us to be really comfortable in funding that. I think then a slight tweak to that is then to allow a shadow tariff where essentially government does protect a little bit of that minimum revenue requirement. So then suddenly government participation is required there. And as a tweak, I think one of the challenges that you potentially might see is that given the lower traffic volumes that we may see, government may suddenly realize that its commitment to this revenue model may be much larger than they had anticipated. So it's quite a tricky one to implement, because you also have to manage essentially the point at which that minimum level is achieved and how that gets transferred between the concessionaire as well as government. Vumile, if you will just then move to the next one. And then another one around availability mechanism. So it's almost progressively start to move the risk away from the concessionaire. So here, essentially, the concession is only incentivized to ensure that the infrastructure asset is available for use. Their risk in terms of market is mitigated. They don't have to worry about that. The level of due diligence is going to be reduced. And obviously, this will probably lead to much more competitive bidding from an investor perspective. However, this also is a little bit inefficient because it doesn't really incentivize the concessionaire to kind of be concerned about traffic volume. They're not really incentivized for increased performance outside of the, I guess, minimum level which they have to reach. And it really does push that risk fully towards government. And again, similarly, in the minimum guaranteed revenue, the government is going to guarantee the minimum payments that need to be done here. And I guess even less funds need to be reserved by the concession authority. The difference will really be made up by the concession authority, and it's not as attractive to investors as it may be. The balance of the risk, again, sitting largely with government and public sector. So I think what we'll start to see in this theme overall is a general tug-of-war relationship between the private sector as well as the public sector in terms of the risk allocation. And I think one of the key ways maybe to potentially look at this is to also then look and see that, when you're looking in your project definition, and I think to the point raised by one of the initial speakers, in the project preparation, one of the key parts is really to understand the actual project definition on whether or not this is the type of project which is suited more towards public risk allocation, or if it's more suited towards private risk allocation. And an example of one that where you can potentially shift towards private risk is the last option, where you look at the industrial users. So as an example, and where you have, I guess, a number of mines who are utilizing a piece of infrastructure which is kind of important to them, and they use it for both receiving goods and sending out of goods, you could essentially impose a levy, and then you transfer, I guess, that market traffic risk towards these entities, and you would be taking more of a corporate risk, as it were, for these mining entities, and potentially as well, obviously, a commodity risk on a long-term basis on whether or not, we think that will be sustainable to manage the financing. Vumile, if you can just move to the next slide, please. I don't want to go into too much detail. And this slide is really just showing the different parties that are typically involved in these funding strategies. So depending on where the risk allocation is and where we're funding at, either to a private entity via an SPV, or whether it's directly on the balance sheet of a public sector entity, you may or may not have the participation of various parties such as the EPC, the O&M, or the SPV itself. Vumile, if you will just move to the next slide, I'm just keen for us to really then look at this type of financing. So us as a commercial bank, typically you can expect to receive reasonable amount of liquidity from the large regional banks as well as the local banks. The challenge, I think, is we've noted there's a high capital cost, and this is going to require extensive and long periods for repayment. And commercial banks don't really have the appetite or the ability to go for longer tenors. I think typically under the project finance, and depending on whether or not the underlying agreements which are bankable have a reliable and long tenor, potentially up to 15 years. Longer than that would be a lot more difficult. I think the challenge that you always have is that a lot of this also requires cooperation with government, and government operates in cycles. Can you really take comfort on political risk over an extended period of 5 or 15 years? That's potentially 2 or 3 election cycles. But the commercial banks do have the ability to kind of manage, almost bring the project to conclusion. So to bring it to a bankability, address the FX risk, the liquidity risk, the interest rate risks that may be associated with the project, finding a structure that potentially can work, testing the structure based on our experience, bring together all the necessary parties, so the public sector as well as the private sector, ensure that due diligence is carried out, ensure that the use of proceeds is done properly. And I think that when we bring in our other funders, this is where we go to the development finance. These entities, their mandate is a little bit more broader in terms of development compared to commercial banks. So they can potentially go up to 20 years. They can do it in hard currency. Their funding in hard currency is actually a lot more attractive than it would be typically for the commercial banks. They don't necessarily see the political risk in the same way that commercial banks might do, and they may have a stronger ability to speak on a government-to-government basis. But we must be aware that they typically have a really long lead time in terms of getting their approvals. They're very rigorous environmental and social policies that need to be followed through. And typically, it takes quite a bit of time to be able to, get them on board. So it's important to engage them at an early stage of the project. I just see a hand. Sorry.
It's Conrad. Yes, sorry. We unfortunately out of time for your slot.
Sure.
I don't know if there was much more you wanted to share here, but we'll be sharing the presentations anyway with the audience.
Yeah.
Sorry for cutting you short on this.
No, that's it.
Okay, so my timing was sort of out.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I think, Conrad, you're on mute.
sorry. Why did I mute myself? So apologies for that. So we've got a good understanding from what the problem is, what the game plan is, and what private capital considerations is. But I think most importantly is where public capital is sitting. And for that purposes, in terms of what the situation there is, we have Dr. Victor Ngobeni from the Infrastructure Fund. He's the head of strategic partnerships and organization at the Infrastructure Fund. Most of us are quite familiar with the Infrastructure Fund in terms of their role and sort of coordinating matters around these type of projects from a government perspective. So I think that sort of takes it full circle in terms of the different considerations here. So Victor, thank you for making time, and we're looking forward to your perspective in terms of the fiscus, the limitations, and the options around that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, and good afternoon to everyone. Vumile, I think let's immediately move into the slides. Let's go to slide 3. Yes, so I thought I should start by really introducing the Infrastructure Fund at a very high level. We are a blended finance platform that has been established by government through a memorandum of agreement between Infrastructure South Africa, the DBSA, as well as National Treasury. What is happening here is that we are currently located within the DBSA for operational purposes. They fund 50% of our operational costs, and National Treasury funds the other 50%. But for capital that we deploy from the BFI, or Budget Facility for Infrastructure, into projects, there's been 100 billion that was provisionally allocated since 2019-20 over a 10-year period, linking with the National Development Plan target of 2030. We are using that 100 billion to structure various blended finance instruments, so grants, concessional loan facilities. In some instances, we do hold senior positions where we also use this capital to crowd in private investment. We can move to the next one. So this is what I've already touched on, the culmination of various instruments to complete the blended finance picture. Our mandate is really, we do not just do grants only. In projects where we are involved, there has to be the confluence of these instruments. And you'll see later in the slides why this is important, because various speakers have already indicated that government alone will not be able to do this. And even with the involvement of the private sector, it's still a very huge mountain to climb. So partnerships are encouraged, and actually this also amplifies the need to collaborate more. And we are doing this all in the name of, alleviating fiscal pressures, but also driving socio-economic development. We can move on. This is the value chain of the infrastructure fund. Currently, before we take any projects to the BFI with the project sponsors, the project sponsors are our client as the IF, and these are institutions in the national, provincial, and local government. They can be departments, they can be provincial entities or national entities, or municipalities and municipal entities. We apply with them to the BFI. Our value proposition is there from point 2 onwards, where in point 2 we program, design, and also structure bespoke financial instruments to be able to deploy to projects. In step 3, that is where we are unlocking that 100 billion that I was talking about. We are not responsible for the procurement and implementation of engineering packages, because the PFMA and the MFMA currently reserves those to project sponsors. However, where there's no capacity, we are able to assist with that. Our role is to procure blended finance instruments, go to the market, engage various lenders to complete the puzzle, deploy the financing, and monitor it alongside the projects that are being done at the sponsor level. We can move to the next one. The crux of the presentation will be from slide 7. I just want to complete the introductions. So in relation to what we have done since inception, we were established in 2020, but really started to operate around May 2021. And this far, we have mobilized about 30 projects with a capital cost of about 142 billion. What has been approved from the BFI, it's about 38 billion, but we are anticipating more for approval in the current round, which is the number that we are seeing from the 56. So out of that 100 billion, we are almost just above 50% of that. They still had room to mobilize more. And I think once it's fully utilized, we can also engage around how to top it up. But of this amount, we are expecting to crowd in about 74 billion from the market, from the private sector. And this is where the partnerships are important. What is important here is to note that we operate in various sectors: human settlements, water and sanitation, transportation, student housing, and we are also starting to delve into municipal energy kind of projects, as well as health projects. We do have numerous triple Ps in our pipeline, but you can see that the pipeline is biased towards water and sanitation for obvious reasons. We are starting to play into the transport space for the purposes of the discussion that we are having here today. Let us move to slide 7. So in relation to transport and logistics, which is the topic of today, you would note that it is about 37% of government spending every year. And over the 2025 MTF, or medium-term expenditure framework, it's about 40% of that. So what you are seeing on this slide is just spending from the public sector side. So every year we spend about, on average, 330 billion on infrastructure. This excludes what the private sector spends, because the private sector will inject about 800 billion more, meaning that on a yearly basis, we spend about 1 trillion, just over 1 trillion, both in public and private spending on infrastructure. And that is still not, enough to be able to really plug the space, because we are targeting 30% of GDP. And these numbers that I'm talking about currently, they're just sitting at about 15% of GDP. So if you want to really improve economic performance through infrastructure, you need to see public and private spending doubling up in the next 5 years. Can we move to the next slide? Vumile, I know that this is not the updated ones, but I'll proceed with these ones. Maybe when you share, you can share the updated ones. So in relation to the NDP targets, this is what I was talking about in relation to 30% of GDP. And you can actually see the where we are hovering in terms of public and private spending. But what is important to indicate here is that as our GDP is growing every year, we are struggling to grow the public and private investment, and we are always, lagging behind. And so what needs to happen, we need to be at 2.3 trillion in the next 5 years. And this is the figures that you only see post-war or after, as a country, you have rediscovered new natural resource endowments like oil. And I don't think we are within the domain of those two currently. So it means that concerted effort needs to be done overall to be able to, hit those levels. We can move to the next one, but the slide that I wanted to share, which is not on the pack, pertains to the RMB study that was done recently. It was published, I think, this week. It is indicating that to unleash the untapped export potential of about 1.3 trillion, we actually need to focus more on transport and logistics. And it's indicating that South Africa is sitting on this untapped potential. If that was to be true, it is actually the economic miracle that we are looking for as the country, because those are a kind of big shocks that you need in the economy to be able to pivot it to higher levels. We can move to the next slide, but this slide is just indicating that as the infrastructure fund, we are focusing more on rail infrastructure and port infrastructure, basically to assist Transnet in overcoming the current bottlenecks that they are having, the so-called binding constraints to their operational performance. I was happy to see earlier slides showing that actually rail volumes and other variables are moving upwards, meaning that the efforts that government is putting in are actually, starting to bear fruits. But what are we doing about it as the infrastructure fund and our government partners? We have started to put together these 6 projects between last year and this year with a capital value of about 48 billion. And from the BFI, we're applying for about 19.8 billion. And if you look at our instruments, almost all of them are concessional loan facilities, basically for number 2 down to number 6. Number 1 was a grant instrument because it befitted that project. You can also see the expected private sector potential in terms of crowding in. I need to indicate that by concessional, we're talking about pricing, we're talking about tenor, which enables Transnet to be able to finance the projects without burdening further its balance sheet. And with this, we are de-risking the projects to enable the private sector to be able to come in, more linking with the presentation that was delivered by a Standard Bank earlier. We can move to the next one. This is just indicating that in our approach, especially for the rail infrastructure, we thought about the PSP model and where we are. In reality, the reforms that are happening are going to take time. I think people are thinking that it's a panacea that will happen overnight. This PSP framework that the minister is talking about is really going to unfold over 2 years, 3 years. So we are saying, while that is happening, we also can't just wait and not do anything because the network will continue to deteriorate. So in the interim, that BFI funding that you saw in the previous slide, we are going to deploy it to Transnet for them to refurbish the infrastructure. And once they've done that, they hand it over to the private sector as they are ready to come in when the process is completed. And on the port side, we are also starting to see Transnet warming up to the idea of allowing private operators to come in where they are responsible for almost the value chain around funding, designing development and construction of port infrastructure. This is really promising in terms of this Section 56 of the Ports Act, which will allow more private sector participation. In the past, you wouldn't have discussion with Transnet. So it shows that in a crisis, there's also opportunities. There are opportunities for efficiencies to be generated. We can move to the next one. This is the last slide of my presentation. The salient points that I wanted to give to the audience is the fact that if you look at what we are doing, two public institutions, which is the Infrastructure Fund and Transnet, came together, supported by other organs of state. So ISA, National Treasury, the Department of Transport, to be able to put together these funding applications to the BFI in a way that doesn't create too much noise, because you would recall that once you talk about bailouts and recapitalization of state-owned entities, it doesn't sit well in the financing market. So the way we are doing it in a way that still maintains the user pays principle, and also ensuring that where users are able to pay for services are actually doing that, especially for commercial projects, rather than giving bailout operational subsidies that are not linked to specific projects. You can also see the state leading the interventions to repair the damaged assets, while also in the reform to strategically attract the private sector to bring the expertise and funding. We also seeing a lot of willingness to do away with old ways, especially on the Transnet front. That's why I say it looks like sometimes a crisis is a good thing, and it's coming with good reforms that are actually moving the country forward. The other point is this affordable concessional facilities that we are talking about, because if you are to do this on balance sheet, it's going to breach the balance sheet covenants of Transnet, and actually they won't be able to afford this lending in the market. So government is also thinking differently around how to help its own in a way that is sustainable amidst fiscal constraints. And the last one is the confluence of these reforms that we are seeing across the board, most of them presented here, but also allowing the private sector to come in, basically showing the need to give effect to this blended finance that we are talking about. So we are very happy to have been invited to present here and also share our ideas around what we are doing. And we're looking for partnerships as we pivot the projects forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. I think that sets the scene in terms of the public capital side of things and the considerations. It's quite clear from all the information and thoughts shared here that there's no silver bullet out there. There's various solutions that need to be put together at a sort of project level and integration level. I think there's various attempts, as per Ian's the reference to the NLCC in terms of the different programs that's being set up and initiatives that's been driven. Unfortunately, we've run over time. Hopefully, some of the audience members still got some time for us to run through a few Q&A questions that's come through. I'm not sure if all our speakers are still around, but let's give it a go and we can briefly run through this. Ayasha has asked a question to Cor in terms of his presentation, if it includes passenger transport modes and infrastructure. Cor, if you can maybe clarify.
I can maybe say that the numbers on the screen were mostly focusing on freight. Passengers obviously is a big issue as well, but no, so specifically those reports were predominantly focusing on freight, with only a few cursory views on the passenger numbers. I can also say that some of the reports do have chapters on passengers, but I think the logistics crisis in the freight world that currently is where the biggest challenge lies. So we can certainly in the next round, Conrad, maybe open up this discussion again about how do we handle all the passengers that also need to move.
Good point. Thanks, Cor. Then we've got various questions from Christian to Standard Bank. Ipinge, if you're still around. How does Standard Bank determine lending rates for PPP projects? What specific indicators do you use beyond the weighted average cost of capital? cost of care to ensure consistency between business plan projections and actual loan conditions? That's quite a loaded question.
It's quite a loaded question because I don't think there's a uniform approach to it. I mean, it's exactly to the point is we need to have a specific project information. None of the PPP projects are necessarily going to be the same unless perhaps, for example, you have a specific program like the REAP program, as it were, where you have very clear uniform parameters that are set out, and those are the conditions under which you have to fund. But generally speaking, we're going to be our lending rates and the risk rates going to be based on the project, kind of what you define as the overall kind of credit risk, what the political risk and various other components will be, and to what extent that's been mitigated. And those are the ones that are ultimately going to develop what we think the overall, at least, cost of our debt is going to be on that project. And then the last point, maybe our due diligence is going to be focused on looking at those business plan projections, making sure, for example, that traffic risk is reasonable. Do we need to have a verified independent study to do so? That might be necessary.
Christian's next question is focused on energy, so if we can skip that one, and maybe if Christian can pose it at one of our energy-focused webinars, then we can get some answers for that. And then the last one is, when setting lending rates, how does Standard Bank and other banks factor in country risk, including political and security risks? Which reports or sources do they rely on to assess these risks? Could you please share with us? So that's an information request, and then so that financial modelers can align their projections with banks' expected rates and account for some same risk considered by the banks. Again, quite a wide question there. I don't know, Pinge, if you want to give some high-level guidance, if you don't mind.
I'll give some high-level guidance. I think obviously the fact that credit reports exist from a number of the rating houses, S&P, Moody's, etc., means that there's kind of a universal platform that people will use as, you know, a basis for their view on a specific country risk. But I think given that we have presence in individual countries, you know, you'll combine your view on what they have to say about it, but also your own on-the-ground local experience, speaking to the government entities, speaking to either the ministry, the state-owned enterprises, and almost inform your own view, which is kind of a blend of what you may get from external parties, what you observe on the ground, just on direct conversations, and I guess historic behavior, to be able to kind of make that assessment of what we think that is. So it's not something that's also universally that, you know, we can share, because again, it's going to be bespoke. It's going to depend on the situation. When we're looking at a transaction, it's one thing to look at the risk there on the transaction, but we will also try and find ways where we can actually reframe that risk. So, for example, if it's a link to another country whose credit profile is a little bit better, we can potentially bring that actual overall credit profile down because we're actually taking more of a credit risk on another party.
Thank you, Pinge. I think that is it for the questions that's been posed in the chat. Lastly, I just want to thank all the speakers for making time, and the audience for registering for the webinar. I think the whole motivation here was to sort of put forward the space that Cresco's been living in for the last 20 years around infrastructure. I mean, we do a lot of advisory work, both public and private, in this space, and yeah, we're seeing quite a pickup. I think the emphasis has been put forward in terms of why there's an urgency in what needs to happen here. But of course, a lot of heavy lifting is needed here. And of course, the advisory support that Cresco provide to the different stakeholders in this space is really where we're looking to sort of drive or assist the wider market and putting forward. But again, thank you for your time, and apologies for running over, about 13 minutes. But yeah, next time we'll try to stick to the timelines. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.